Welcome to week 6 basketball. It's my favorite sport. It's the sport I've followed for the longest, probably. And I picked this photograph on purpose because I think it really encapsulates why basketball during the 1980s really kind of grew to become the second sport surpassing baseball. And it really firmly has a hold on that second sport status right now, and is the most globalized of the American team professional sports by far. But they did a great job of marketing East Coast versus West Coast, Celtics versus Lakers, the white star versus the black star, the sort of the hard hat lunch pail work ethic Celtics versus the fast break flashy Lakers. But as is so often the case, these things are manufactured, and as it turns out, the Celtics had a great fast break. Okay, it wasn't just the Lakers that had a fast break, and the Lakers had hard-working, working class type players too. The reason they were both so successful is they could play both styles. They were both tough. They could both run. They both had a fast break, and they both had big men. The two men featured here on this slide, who were big but could pass, who had great court vision, and who weren't all that different from one another, in that they both grew up in the upper Midwest. They both grew up in kind of a poverty type situation, but with a tremendous competitive spirit. Okay, so they Magic was from the city, Bird was from the countryside, but they both grew up with very humble origins and beginnings. That's one reason why they became such good friends, I think. So the NBA would market Magic versus Bird. It kind of found these two people that they constructed as polar opposites. They only played each other twice a year. Out of 82 games, you only play your opponent in the other league twice. But what they would do would be they would have a doubleheader, and the first game would be Lakers versus Phoenix Suns or something, West Coast rival, and then it would probably be like Boston versus Philadelphia. So you get to see first the Lakers and then the Celtics, and then twice a year you'd get to see them against each other, and perhaps in the finals. The other reason it was such good theater is that the Lakers and the Celtics had met like 8 times in the 1960s. We all know how that went. So just a little bit of history about basketball. It was invented in 1891 by a Canadian instructor at a YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts, that's where the Hall of Fame is today. And it's interesting, his name was James Naismith, and he was a graduate of McGill College. McGill College also played in the very first official football game with North American rules against Harvard. And McGill sort of fielded the first hockey, or the first real true hockey with modern rules. Was contested by a team from McGill. So, 3 out of the McGill University, which is this university in Montreal, Canada, sort of has a claim to 3 of the 4 major American professional sports, which is pretty astonishing. But what James Naismith did was put a peach basket up, and you have to try to get the ball in the peach basket. And, they got kind of sick of clambering up there and getting it out, so finally they cut the bottom out of it so it could drop through. That led to rims with netting, eventually nylon netting, and eventually the sort of the more forgiving spring rims. But it's come a long way. But it's more or less the same game, the same goal. Take a round ball and put it through a hoop. Okay. It quickly spread to other YMCAs and YWCAs as well. Initially as a game largely restricted to women's athletics, but increasingly as a game played by both genders. Okay, so it really caught on in YWCAs, which stands for Young Women's was it collegiate athletics? I'm not sure what YMCA. YMCA used to be a big deal, but it's kind of declined to the present day. Where the sport really first kind of became commonplace and widely spread was in more rural areas, particularly the Midwest, with schools like Kansas, Kentucky, and Indiana becoming bastions of the collegiate game. Those were the powerhouses, okay? And people in rural areas in these states would play it, and then these schools would collect the best of the surrounding areas and offer them college scholarships, and that's why these schools were predominant, particularly Indiana and Kentucky in the early years. The sport helped to legitimize the fledgling NCAA. The NCAA sort of needed sports that were on the up and coming sports to sort of partner with, and basketball, the rise of basketball and the rise of the NCAA kind of went hand in hand. By 1920, there were numerous local professional leagues, or more often semi-professional. They paid a salary, but you still had to have a job type deal. And by 1950, several of the more regional leagues, particularly in the upper Midwest and the East Coast, combined to form the National Basketball Association. And, you just have to trace back your favorite team sometimes to find out where they came from. Like for instance, the Detroit Pistons used to be in Fort Wayne, Indiana. You've never heard of this town. It's not that big a town. Buffalo, New York. I think who was it that came from Buffalo, New York? Sacramento Kings came from Kansas City. I had another good example of teams that just kind of came from smaller towns. I can't think of it. I'll probably come to me later. Yeah, some of the teams like Boston Celtics. It was the Lakers. Came from Minneapolis. Upper Midwest. Big city, but not nearly as big as Los Angeles. Some teams like the Knicks and the Celtics did come from the cities that they're still in, but a lot of other teams moved from smaller cities to bigger ones. Following World War II, the game continued to flourish among rural white communities in the Midwest. And you saw the colleges associated with those communities continue to do very well, particularly Kentucky. At the same time, urbanization brought the game to northern cities. The game was already popular at black colleges in the South by this point. And the demographic shift of that we saw, starting in the 1870s and following through into the 1950s, of slowly but surely a lot of black Americans from the South, African Americans moving from the South, where they were being mistreated and not accorded equal rights, moving to northern urban communities where the jobs were. This demographic shift helps bring larger numbers of African Americans to northern cities, such as Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and other cities. And with it comes basketball. Okay, so now basketball is becoming a very sort of northern sport, not West Coast, not South, but Midwest and northern cities. Okay. At that point, following World War II, the first superstar, which is a Minneapolis Laker by the name of George Mikan. He was very, very dominant, one of the most dominant players for his time. It always just bugs me that the Lakers didn't used to count the Minneapolis championships until they started getting close to the Celtics mark. Well, now they do count the Minneapolis Laker championships, but they don't retire George Mikan's number, which I think is criminal, since he single-handedly gave them 5 of their championships. So, but the point is that it found its first superstar. People wanted to tune in and see this freak called George Mikan, who was 6'10", 6 feet 10 inches tall, and was this big ox of a man that no one could stop. I think today you just get pushed around in the low post, but back then centers tended to be 6'7". Okay, people taller than a certain point didn't appear to be athletic enough to be able to compete. But he did. I mean, he proved that if you work hard enough, if you're big, yes, you might have to do a lot of training to become quicker and whatnot. But if you worked at it, you could do it, and then you would dominate the 6'7", 6'6" centers. So sort of throughout the 50s and 60s, you're seeing this growth of basketball, particularly in northern urban communities. You're seeing a different style of basketball that's more fast pace. They used to have set shots, which is where you stop and you wanted to be your feet completely still. So you didn't leave the ground. You didn't jump for a shot, because then if you jump, who knows what's going to happen. You might jump and you'll be a little bit this way or a little bit this way. So they would set, and they would often kind of throw things up from their right shoulder. If you watch basketball games from the 1940s and early 50s, it's kind of funny. So it was a different style of play was being sort of innovated, particularly among black players. Were sort of doing a more running style, a more athletic style. Hey, if I jump in the air and I train myself to jump completely straight, it takes a lot of it takes a lot of hard work. But if I work on my shot, if I jump in the air and shoot, it's gonna be harder for them to block my shot. Okay. So certainly by the 1960s, this new form of basketball was commonplace, it still was developing during the 1960s. But this is where we can really chart modern basketball too, is that decade, and even early in that decade. Of course, during that time period, there's this big dynasty in the NBA called the Boston Celtics that won 8 in a row and 11 of 13. And the thing is, were they that much better than everyone else? The answer is no. They played in, was it like 21 game sevens or something like that? Or at least Bill Russell played in 21 game sevens and he won 21 of them. Okay. Or it's 23 or something. It's like early 20s. They just were extremely competitive, extremely professional, extremely well coached. They were really, really good, and they knew what to do, and they were sort of a very professional team that was not selfish at all. If somebody didn't have the hot hand, even if they were the star, they deferred to someone else. And this basketball player named Bill Russell kind of kept everyone in line. He did not allow ego to go onto the court. By the 1970s, basketball has changed once again. By this point, the increased dominance of black players, both numerically, but in particular in skill, sort of created a kind of a racial divide in basketball, with a lot of white fans claiming they were turned off by the play, although they certainly would go and watch it. I think it really was exposing fault lines between what people wanted to see in terms of play. They enjoyed this kind of up-tempo, more athletic style of game, but yet at the same time, a lot of white Americans were very uncomfortable with seeing the predominance of black athletes. So the 1970s kind of there was this divide between the fundamental NBA, which was a little bit whiter, and the so-called flashy ABA, a sort of a rival league that got started in 1966, and that some of our teams today come from the ABA, including San Antonio Spurs, Indiana Pacers, and others. And during this time period, the ABA had a greater percentage of African Americans than the NBA. And there was this sort of is white basketball, superior, is black basketball superior? Well, once again, this was a constructed argument, because there was a lot of players in the NBA that were, high flying and dunking the ball and very athletic. And, And there was a lot of fundamental play in the ABA. And there was a lot of black players that were very fundamentally sound and a lot of white players. I mean, the flashiest player of this time, if you'd say, okay, so who is the flashiest player of the 1970s? A few people would say Dr. J. The majority of people would say Pistol Pete Maravich, who was white. Okay. So, I mean, once again, our brains as fans are we like to see things in dichotomies. We like to see things in black and white. In this case, literally black and white. A lot more complicated than that. But this tapped into pre-existing racial anxieties and the sort of the long hangover of the American Civil Rights Movement, when the American Civil Rights Movement kind of swept a lot of racist ideas and stereotypes to the side, but it didn't completely sweep them out the door. They just kind of went underground, figure out new ways to manifest themselves. And we see it today, even with the kind of it shocked me in 2016 with how prevalent white supremacists were, marching in Virginia and whatnot. Well, it turns out they've been there all along. They've just been kind of underground a little bit where, people like me, I mean, I'm a white male, so I don't, perhaps notice it as much. But also I think we live in California where this isn't as prevalent. And, I spent all my time at a university essentially. So, where these types of ideas don't tend to find expression. So, I was surprised at the extent of this in the United States when Trump kind of allowed it to kind of come above ground. That was happening in the 1970s. Okay. There was kind of a little bit of a backlash to the civil rights movement. And, one way it was manifested itself was in white fans kind of denigrating this new product of basketball, which was very, very exciting, which was, I think, a better type of game. And it's the game that we have inherited today, which is at a very high level. Now, there were some bona fide superstars in the 1970s, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Bill Walton. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar being sort of the forgotten man, and I don't put him on my Mount Rushmore, and I feel a little bit guilty about that because he is one of the best. But he just kind of, gets kind of eclipsed by a couple of other big men, and it's he sort of doesn't get his due. And Bill Walton was every bit as good as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar until he started breaking his feet and hurting his knees. In fact, he was probably at one point a little bit better. Certainly in college he was, and when he came into the early pros, he was just sort of always a little bit developmentally, and then like 3 years in, broke his foot, and I can't remember how many surgeries he's had on different parts of his feet and legs and knees over the years, but significant. So there was a few bona fide superstars, but the league was at an ebb. There were fewer superstars. There was a lot of fighting. You saw the punch of Rudy Tomjanovich that almost killed him. There was a lot of cocaine scandals. There was this racial tension, and the fact that you probably either watched the ABA or the NBA, so the superstars were kind of spread out and diffused between the two leagues. The NBA was at an ebb, and all this, they've been building momentum since the first Peach Basket was put up. Slowly but surely, but things were kind of in a little bit of trouble. Well, then come Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, and it starts with actually a college game, the first meeting of their many meetings, in the finals. And again, it was sort of like, two very big differences. It was sort of the small rural school that had never been to the NCAA, before. No one had ever heard of this place before. It was Indiana State University. It wasn't even Indiana. It was Indiana State University. This sort of like the ultimate Cinderella, the ultimate David. They were undefeated that year until the very last game. And then you had Michigan State, which is this big urban school, this perennial basketball powerhouse, not just Magic Johnson, but a number of other really good players. They were all really tall, whereas the Indiana State team Larry Bird was their only star, was just a bunch of other stiffs, basically. There was this one other guy named Heaton that was quite a clutch player and made a lot of big shots. But, I mean, they were like, they're starting set. I mean, they were all, you look at them standing there and, like on average, they were giving up 3 or 4 inches to the other team. So, that kind of launched, it was a launching pad. And then they went to 2 different leagues, 2 different teams, 2 different storied teams, 2 teams that had a lot of competition with each other in the finals. So they walked into kind of a prefab storyline, and then they populated it relentlessly by being great basketball players, by being great leaders, by both teams were able to put a really good surrounding cast. As much as I hated Michael Cooper, I would have taken him in a heartbeat on the Celtics. And the Lakers would have done the same with Kevin McHale. Just they became very clearly and very quickly. They turned the fortunes of their teams around, and then they had a competition going forward for the next number of years. They resuscitated the brand during the 1980s, and then a player by the name of Michael Jordan comes along, and he takes that resuscitated brand and he just grabs it and skies through the air with it, and so dunks it. I'm not sure where my metaphor ends, but Michael Jordan really built upon Larry Bird, Magic Johnson. But if he hadn't come along, I wonder if it certainly wouldn't have gone to where it did. You needed Larry Bird and Magic Johnson to turn it around and provide the bedrock, and then you needed Michael Jordan to come along and take the brand and make it a global brand. He transformed the relationship between sports and marketing in the United States and brought an international spotlight to the sport because he seemed like he could defy gravity. There were other sort of above the rim players, David Thompson in the 1970s, Dr. J in the 1970s, Dominique Wilkins just a few years before Michael Jordan came into the league, 1 year before Michael, 1 year before Michael Jordan, I think, 2 years. So he wasn't the first that could kind of do these amazing things, but he did it on such a consistent high level, and he was really, really good too. He was better than these other guys, and it became very, very quickly evident that he was heading towards being something pretty special. Okay. In the new business model, an athlete's salary could be incidental compared to their endorsements. First nationally with shoe deals and other things of that nature, but also internationally as well. And Michael Jordan began building I think they thought that they gave him Nike gave him $100,000 to sign, if I remember correctly. And everyone thought that it was a big mistake. Why are you giving him that much money? They thought they would get 3 million sales in the first year. They got 150 million and immediately renegotiated with him. I mean, they understood we have to keep him happy. And he made a lot more money from endorsements than he ever did. And a lot of, particularly basketball players and golfers and, tennis. I mean, there are a lot of athletes and a lot of sports do very, very well. Although two that haven't as much are football and baseball. There are some football stars that make a lot of money in endorsements, but a lot of them don't. And same thing with baseball. There are a few, but a lot of their endorsements are more local. Whereas it's basketball and then it's individual sports, football, tennis, golf, and car racing as well. Jimmy Johnson and things of that nature. I mean, basketball athletes move the needle better than any other North American professional athlete in a team sports and really in any sport. And that's really because of Michael Jordan. These shoe deals are just crazy. I mean, you're talking about people getting shoe deals that are like drafted late in the first round. They have no idea whether or not even they're, but you got to sign them because what happens if they turn into the next Michael Jordan? You want to have their signature there. Here's the real irony. The guys that murdered Michael Jordan's father to rob him were wearing Michael Jordan shoes. That's how big the shoes were. Basketball is the only one of the big four American team sports with truly global appeal. Baseball does have appeal in a few places in Asia and in sort of Latin America. Couldn't care less in Europe and a few other places, about baseball. Football has appeal for the Super Bowl. A lot of internationally people tune in for the Super Bowl, but the NFL doesn't even have a team in Canada. They're trying to get a team in London. It looks like they will, and maybe even Mexico City. But hockey does have some appeal in Scandinavia and Europe, in Canada, but that's not really international. But basketball is played all over Europe. It's played in China. Argentina is a big, Puerto Rico. There's a lot of places that have professional leagues. Lithuania, Israel. There's just professional leagues all over the world. Basketball is the